now.
Developing tonight, new controversy involving Vice President Dick Cheney and his latest scathing assessment of President Obama's foreign policy. It all started with a question about Iran. But Mr. Cheney went off on the commander-in-chief's policies as a whole, going so far as to say that he thinks our current commander-in-chief may be the worst our nation has ever seen.
If you had somebody as president who wanted to take America down, who wanted to fundamentally weaken our position in the world, reduce our capacity to influence events, turn our back on our allies and encourage our adversaries, it would look exactly like what Barack Obama is doing. I think his actions are constituted, in my mind, those of the worst president we've ever had.
Joining me now, former New York State Governor George Pataki. Governor, good to see you.
Good to see you, Megan.
Too harsh?
I think it's pretty accurate. This president, I don't think it's intentional, but he has weakened America in a way that no president in my lifetime has ever come close to weakening America.
Well, I mean, how so? Because, you know, obviously Dick Cheney, I think he would qualify as a neocon in Rand Paul's, estimation. Yeah. And the argument against, you heard Rand Paul making the argument against him, that against that sort of policy, that approach.
I agree that we shouldn't be trying to look for war for the solution to everything, but on the other hand, our allies don't trust us. Our enemies don't fear us. And that's a consequence of this president's policy. He has weakened our military. He has ended so many of our allies' trust that they used to have in American support, particularly Israel and other countries in the Middle East. He's been on the wrong side of so many issues, like drawing a red line in Syria and not standing up to it. And I fear now that with the accord he apparently is still trying to hammer out with Iran, that this is going to create a very short pathway for Iran to get nuclear weapons. All of it weakens America.
But, you know, the president's defenders would look at Dick Cheney and say, Bush-Cheney got us into, forget Afghanistan, but at least Iraq, based on what they say was a false premise. And they believe that that created a new field of enemies against us in the Middle East, and we're still paying that debt.
Megan, it's not about the past. It's about today and the future. And today, our allies just don't trust us. Our military is weak. Iranian hegemony is going forward in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in ways that we haven't seen.
Do you
in
not
countries
think that
like
would have
Egypt.
happened? If we had a Bush-Cheney administration for another 8 years, do you not think we would have seen the growth of ISIS and the collapse of the Middle East as we knew it?
No, I don't, because I think that when President Obama withdrew those last troops from Iraq, he created a vacuum. ISIS filled that vacuum. If we had stayed there, supported the Baghdad government, an inclusive Baghdad government that included Kurds and included Sunnis, I don't think ISIS would have ever reached this point.
What about
I think
the Arab
it's because
Spring?
of that
We
weakness.
saw all these dictators fall. And there's a real question about whether that wound up being a good thing for America.
I think we made a hideous mistake in telling Mubarak, who was our ally in Egypt for 20 years, to leave immediately when more intelligent voices were saying, let's look for a transition.
What about Gaddafi in Libya?
I think we did make a mistake there. I think Gaddafi had given up his nuclear weapons, and I think there it was leading from behind. When America leads from behind, we leave chaos behind, and that's what happened in Libya. I think there we should have not gone after Gaddafi. He was not a friend of ours, but he created stability, and now you do have ISIS, you do have al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and other radical Islamic forces, in large part controlling that country, imposing a threat to us.
It's depressing.
It's depressing for the moment, but we're still America, and we can turn this around so quickly. We have the greatest military in the world, and we have trust. If people can trust our leadership, they trust the American people. So sure, it's disappointing today, but things are going to get better.
Governor, good to see you.
Good to see you.
And welcome to Hannity. Tonight, President Obama does it again, and he deliberately attacks Christianity. Now, he said this yesterday during the White House Easter prayer breakfast.
On Easter, I do reflect on the fact that as a Christian, I am supposed to love. And I have to say that sometimes when I listen to less than loving expressions by Christians, I get concerned.
Maybe it was Reverend Wright for 20 years. Now, this is not the first time the president has taken it upon himself to lecture Christians. Now, remember back in February when he said this while giving a speech about the rise of ISIS and radical Islam.
Remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. Slavery and Jim Crow all too often was justified in the name of Christ.
Now, here's what I find so troubling. Now, the president is so quick to lecture Christians time and time again, but since the beginning of his administration, well, the president has gone way out of his way time and time again to defend the Muslim religion. Watch this.
The United States is not and will never be at war with Islam. As a student of history, I also know civilization's debt to Islam. Islam has always been a part of America's story. I'm also proud to carry with me the goodwill of the American people and a greeting of peace from Muslim communities in my country. Assalamu alaikum. Islam is not part of the problem in combating violent extremism. It is an important part of promoting peace. Our enemies respect no religious freedom. Al-Qaeda's cause is not Islam. It's a gross distortion of Islam. The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam. ISIL is not Islamic. No religion condones the killing of innocents, and the vast majority of ISIL's victims have been Muslim. We have reaffirmed again and again that the United States is not and never will be at war with Islam. Islam teaches peace.
Here now with reaction, author of Climate Change, The Facts, Mark Stein is back with us. You know, when he was running for office the first time, you know, the tides were going to recede. He was uniquely qualified as somebody that went to a Muslim school in Indonesia as a child to bridge the gap between these two worlds, the Western world, the Islamic world. When you listen to his attacks on Christianity, him constantly praising the future does not belong to those that slander the prophet, what is your reaction? Where is this coming from in your view?
Well, if I'd been at that prayer breakfast, I would have shouted out shame. And I think it's a pretty poor reflection, even on presumably loyal liberal Democrats in that audience, that no one objected to it. Because it is time for people to object to it. This is part of a conscious strategy. Just before he stood up and made that condescending remark, and by the way, he's no more an expert on Christianity than he is on Islam. You got the impression from his thing about loving each other that he'd maybe seen a production of Godspell in high school, and that's about as far as it goes. But 148 young students in Kenya had just been killed, slaughtered, their bodies on the floor by Muslim fanatics who asked the students in that university, are you Christian or are you Muslim? And they let the Muslims go and they slaughtered the Christians. Now this is a guy who's happy to draw general lessons when a black youth gets killed in Ferguson, Missouri. That apparently has wide application for black people all over America. But 148 black corpses has no general application. Well, Mr. President, hashtag Black Lives Matter when they're Christian too. And the biggest story of our time is the extinction of some of the oldest Christian communities on the planet at the hands of Islam remorselessly. You dishonor those Kenyan students in death by not identifying them as Christian, as you dishonored the Egyptians only a couple of weeks earlier.
Do you remember early on there was a piece in the New York Times by Nicholas Kristof where he said Obama, quoted with a first-rate accent, that the most beautiful sight in all the world was the Muslim call to prayer at sunset. To what extent now that all of these events have happened, do you think he was influenced by his attendance at that Muslim school in Jakarta as a youth? And what do you glean from those comments?
Well, you know, here's a guy who was essentially raised by white grandparents, and he sought, I think, consciously a more exotic identity. I'm not saying that in a particularly partisan way. When Jeb Bush, who comes from the whitest white-bread family in America, chooses to identify himself as Hispanic, he's also seeking consciously a more exotic identity.
But that was a mistake. I mean, in fairness to Jeb Bush.
Well, whatever, but I think you can make the case that to a certain type of person, the exotic is more appealing than the everyday.
Yeah.
And so I think in that sense, Christianity for him is something he associates with white imperialism, whereas Islam is the exotic other and it's the victim group. And the fact is that on his watch, The last Christian church in Afghanistan was razed to the ground on America's watch. The Christian community in Iraq, an American protectorate, has been exterminated on America's watch, and that is something that ought to be shameful for him. And people ought to. This isn't funny, by the way. We've seen this guy who staged this act of Rose Garden Theatre over Bo Bergdahl. It's not a small thing when the leader of a supposedly free people lies to those people about what's going on in the world.
But there seems to be a certain level of ignorance that it's not funny. You're right that, you know, he's reading a teleprompter and repeatedly says in a speech, Navy corpsman, apparently not knowing what a corpsman is, or similarly making comments about the Crusades without the knowledge and understanding that it was a Christian response to Muslim aggression and a desire to get back Christian holy sites. But he said this one thing that I want to take issue with. He said, sometimes when I listen to less than loving expressions by Christians, I get concerned. Now, he spent 20 years in this man's church, Reverend Wright.
We bombed Hiroshima, we bombed Nagasaki, and we nuked far more than the thousands in New York and the Pentagon, and we never batted an eye. Because the stuff we have done overseas is now brought right back into our own front yards. America's chickens are coming home to roost. No, no, no. Not God bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating us citizens as less than human.
Isn't that the epitome of a less than loving comment by a Christian? He sat there for 20 years.
Yeah. Well, he apparently dozed. He was in the pews dozing through all that stuff and has no memory of it. Didn't make much impression of it.
Yeah.
I don't think in any sense he is a Christian, Sean. I think he's a social justice warrior who, like a lot of people from the cultural left, regards religion as the opiate of the rubes, to modify Marx. But I think in Obama's case, it's compounded by the fact that he does have this profound respect for Islam that leads him actually to invert the situation that's going on in the world today, so that the Christians are the problem and the Muslims who are beheading the Christians and shooting the Christians and cutting the throats of the Christians are somehow the victim group that we all need to be more sensitive to.
It's very upside down, isn't it? And for example, his treatment of Israel, and even negotiating with the Iranians, he admits that he's going to give them the bomb in 13 years, that it will be a zero breakout time. And I'm thinking, you know, just the opposite of what an intelligent person, in my view, would do. And then he makes, Dick Cheney had an observation. He made it on the Hugh Hewitt radio show. And I want you to respond to this and ask you whether you agree with the former vice president's comments.
If you had somebody as president who wanted to take America down, who wanted to fundamentally weaken our position in the world, reduce our capacity to influence events, turn our back on our allies, and encourage our adversaries, it would look exactly like what Barack Obama is doing. I think his actions are constituted, in my mind, those of the worst president we've ever had.
What's your reaction?
Yeah, I think Mr. Cheney's lifted my line. I think I said a few weeks ago, if Obama were working for the other side, what would he be doing differently? We've just turned Iran into a nuclear threshold state. Iran controls 4 Middle Eastern capitals. It controls Aden, a critical seaport. We've hollowed out and turned into failed states Libya and Yemen. America is at best a bystander in the world, and at worst colluding with some of the most dangerous and brutal violent forces on the planet. As I said, if he were working for the other side, what would he be doing differently?
You know, I've now come to the conclusion, having studied him now going way back to 2007, Mark, there is an unknown something with Obama, an untold story. I don't know what it is. People are going to say, well, they're going to assume what I'm thinking. I don't know the answer. But everything is upside down in the world of Obama, and none of it makes a lot of sense to me, and it seems extraordinarily dangerous, both on foreign policy and even the economy, doubling the debt and all these people on food stamps and in poverty. So, all right, Mark, thank you. Good to see you. And let me ask you, and dovetail here into the president's comments that he made on NPR. It's amazing to me that the Iranians in the middle of negotiations with Kerry and Obama say the destruction of Israel is non-negotiable, chanting death to America. The president was asked about making this a condition in an NPR interview. I want to play his answer. Listen to this.
The notion that we would condition Iran not getting nuclear weapons in a verifiable deal on Iran recognizing Israel is really akin to saying that we won't sign a deal unless the nature of the Iranian regime completely transforms. And that is, I think, a fundamental misjudgment. The key here is not to somehow expect that Iran changes.
Wait a minute. So we can't get the Iranians at the table to recognize Israel, and the president revealed this week that the breakout time, according to him, in year 13 for Iran making a weapon is 0. They can build a bomb with the Obama seal on it. What's your reaction to that?
Well, first of all, it's not even recognize Israel, let alone recognize it as a Jewish state. It has the right to exist. And the Iranians say, we're not going to discuss that, because I guess they don't. And Obama says, look, we're not going to discuss that either. Let me tell you something, Sean, which is absolutely disgusting and unconscionable for an American president. But I'll tell you what. If Barack Obama had been president rather than Ronald Reagan, the Soviet Union would still be around, because Reagan's attitude was that regime, that totalitarian regime that had fought 2 wars, that had been around a long, long time, that had nuclear missiles and tanks and planes and bombers and everything else, had to collapse. And he did everything he could to cause it to collapse, and it collapsed. And he would never have said, look, we can't change the Soviet regime, so we'll negotiate the best deal we can with it. His attitude was, no, we're going to use economic sanctions, we're going to build up the military, we're going to use our satellite countries and our allies, and we're going to take that regime down without firing a bullet.
Yeah. Let me ask you.
Barack Obama is a disaster. He's the worst president in my lifetime. There's no question about that.
All right.